Hi there guys. So I wanted to make a quick video for you today about the importance of high-pass filters in audio engineering. Now, basically what a high-pass filter does is remove low-frequency noise. Right? It's called a high-pass filter because it lets the high frequencies pass and it doesn't let the low frequencies pass. And in recording, high-pass filters are extremely important because if you're making just a basic one microphone recording, you may not notice it. But if you make tracks like I do that contain many instruments, the low frequency information can build up very quickly. And that will give you an extremely muddy mix, as they say, meaning that it will sound like it lacks clarity. It will lack definition because there'll be so much type bass information going on, which is totally normal. Whenever you tap your foot next to a microphone, you're going to get extra bass information that is not going to help your music mix or your audio mix if you're, your audio mix in general, let's say. You might be recording voiceovers. So this is the importance of having high-pass filters to take out the information you don't need from your microphone signal and to keep the information that you need. Now, standard levels for high-pass filters are 100 Hertz, for example, is common. So if you're recording anything besides a kick drum or a bass instrument like a bass guitar, and you plan on having a full mix, then you're going to want a high-pass filter, for example, your guitars, your vocals. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if the guitar is going to be your bass instrument, meaning that you're not going to have bass instruments in your mix, say it's just you're recording one track of vocals and one track of guitars, well then you might want to leave the extra bass information, the lowest bass information of the guitar in there. So this video is basically concerning the tracks in a full track production that includes specific bass instruments that you don't want to have that extra bass information in because it's just going to muddy up your mix. Okay? So now that I've got all that discussion out of the way, well, how can you actually high-pass filter your tracks? What are the easiest ways or the best ways when you're recording to get that extra information out of there? Well, as is logical, the best way to do it is to get the low frequency information out of there as quickly as possible, as close to the source as possible. Well, you might say, to begin with, don't tap your foot when you're next to the microphone. Well, that's good in theory, that's good from a technical point of view, but if you get a better performance while tapping your foot or moving around or whatever out of yourself or whoever you're recording, then you're not really going to want to go that route. It may just be distracting. You may just put the performer off by trying to get them to stop thumping their foot or moving around while they're singing or playing or whatever. So the next best thing, because performance is more important than the technical side, always, having an amazing performance and the mix is a little muddy is going to be better than having a mix with clarity and a really lame performance because the singer's so used to tapping their foot and you're just not going to let them. No, that's not the way to go. Just let them tap their foot, and you got to take the right precautions and measures to get rid of that extra low frequency information. So the best way to get rid of low frequency information, or the best way to apply a high pass filter, is at the source, at the microphone. So you may have a microphone with a high pass filter on it. That's ideal. But a lot of your most basic microphones don't have high pass filters on them. a lot of you out there that are using a Shure SM57 to record, well, it doesn't have a high-pass filter on it. If you go to a microphone that's a little more expensive, like the Shure SM7, which I'll pull out here, it has, as I showed on I did a video on the Shure SM7, but we're gonna put this in the light for you. It has a set of 2 filters on the back, one of which is a high-pass filter that I almost always have engaged like I do right now. So more expensive microphones will have a high-pass filter, and if you're looking at more expensive microphones, I would encourage you to treat that as something somewhat important. In any case, it is if, once again, with all the criteria that I stated before, meaning that you enjoy or plan on producing tracks that have producing music, for example, that has a lot of tracks on it, like I do. So another option to cut out low frequency information at the microphone, if you have a microphone that doesn't have a high-pass filter on it, so we're going to shift over now to my microphones that are set up, is, for example, you can buy, I have this Shure separate high-pass filter. And all a high-pass filter is technically is a capacitor and a resistor. You can look it up online. And if you feel like you'd rather build it yourself than spend the money, you have to get two XLR jacks, one on each side. You put a resistor and a capacitor of the right values in between, you got yourself a high-pass filter. So I use this, again, in the situation that I described at the beginning of the video, when it's going to be a track that's in a multi-track production that has other bass instruments in it, which is most frequently the case for me. I'm going to high-pass filter at the microphone all of the vocals and all the guitars, for example. And so I'll show you what this high-pass filter looks like set up on one of my microphones that I have set up. I already did a video about this microphone, the Shure Beta 58A. I often have it set up in my little studio here just to do my initial version of the vocals, which often ends up being the final version. So that's what it looks like with the XLR cable plugged in to the high-pass filter, which is plugged into the microphone. So that's the best case. That's the best case if you can high-pass filter right at the microphone. Why is it the best case? Why is it different than using a high-pass filter on your DAW? Well, from experience, it really is. In the worst case, if you don't have any high-pass filters whatsoever, you can obviously use a high-pass filter on your DAW on your computer. But I can tell you that it's not going to do the same job. It's going to end up being a lot more muddy than it would have been if you had used a high-pass filter at the source, meaning at the microphone. Or even better, like I said, if you have a singer or a performer who's comfortable performing without tapping their foot or moving around, well, if you can get a great performance that way, then awesome. Then you won't even have to worry about a high-pass filter, although I would add one anyway, just in case. So the best case scenario for high-pass filtering is at the microphone. Well, if you don't have one on your microphone, what could you do? Well, some preamplifiers have high-pass filters on them, and that's the next best case. So I'll show you my high-pass filters that are on my 2 external preamps. As I've shown you in some of my other videos, I have 2 external preamps. One is the Golden Age Project, or GAP as many people say, pre-73 DLX. Well, where is the high pass filter? Here it is right here, and there are different values on there. It has what? Off, which I use when I record bass. It has 50 Hertz, which is a setting that I find is fairly useless. It has 80 Hertz, which is what I would use for voice and guitar if I didn't have mics with high pass filters on them, or external high pass filters like that Shure high pass filter that I just showed you. And then it has 160 and 300, which 300 is really high for a high pass filter. It can, you might want to use it on a specific track where you want a certain sort of telephone type effect. If you want the voice to sound like it's coming through a telephone line or something like that, that might be reasonable. But otherwise, that would be removing much too much low frequency information from the signal itself, not just the rumble. And I have the Day King Mic Pre 1, which also conveniently has a high pass filter built in that goes from 0, and this one you can set on any frequency you want, which is quite nice, and it goes all the way up to 200, which might be a nice frequency for recording, for example, the ukulele, which I record sometimes. Voice or guitar, you might set it at, usually I set it between 75 or 120, depending. You have to listen and experiment. And here, you might even want to set it to 10 or 20 if you're recording bass, but I usually don't use any high pass filters at all when I record bass, just so that it has as much oomph as possible. And so that, as I said, is the second best if you can find a high pass filter that's built into a preamp, if you have one. So again, as I stated, when I shop for microphones, finding a microphone that has a high pass filter is definitely a plus for me. And when I look at preamps, having a high pass filter on the preamp is definitely a plus for me. Because up until recently, before I bought these Shure external high pass filters that I use with my simple Shure dynamic microphones, like the SM58 or the SM57 or the Beta 58 or the Beta 57, all of which I use from time to time. All of these microphones, as I said, don't have high pass filters, and so before I got this element, when I used those microphones, I used the high pass filters on my preamps. And that, in my experience, as I said, is much better than using a high pass filter in my DAW. So once again, you know, closer to the source, you cut out that low frequency information that you don't need, the better. And of course, the last resort, you can tell where I'm going here, I imagine, is, of course, to use a high pass filter in your DAW, whatever that is. Here's my screen up on a project that I'm working on, and I suppose we can go in here just for your viewing pleasure and bring up, what do I usually use on vocals? I'll usually go into, let's see, favorites. Yeah, it's called Equilibrium. I'm in the middle of doing a video. It's called Equilibrium by DMG Audio. And I have a high pass filter set up here that's at 195 Hertz. That's another thing with high pass filters that you may want to be aware of, and this is a good opportunity to explain that to you. So you have the cutoff frequency of the high pass filter, which is denoted here which you can see changing. Now it's about 120 Hertz. I can move it up to 390 Hertz or down here to 32 Hertz. Like I said, on bass instruments, I often don't use a high-pass filter at all, although sometimes it may be necessary depending on the situation. On guitar or vocals, often in my DAW, I do add a high-pass filter even after the high-pass filtering that has been done at the microphone or the preamp. So often in that case, I'll have a high-pass filter at 60 or 70 on all vocals and guitar. Now the thing is, if I didn't high-pass filter at the microphone or preamp level, I probably would need, from experience from the past, to bring the high-pass filter up even further for it to not sound muddy. But that would be at the price of cutting off some of the bass information of the instrument. And in some cases, when you have a track with a very high frequency range like a ukulele, or a track where you want to give it a sort of telephone effect, like I said, you may bring up the high pass filter quite a bit higher, like 500 Hertz here or whatever. You have to experiment to see what fits into your track specifically. So in addition to that, in addition to the frequency cutoff, which has been here it's 204.5 Hertz, there is also what is called the slope of the high-pass filter. What is the slope? That means how quickly the high-pass filter cuts off low-frequency information. So what we have going on here is this information is more or less being cut out of the signal. The information from 0 Hertz to maybe about 100 Hertz is almost completely taken out of our signal. And the information from about 300 Hertz or 400 Hertz here is totally left alone. And then there's a frequency range of transition here where frequencies are allowed through more and more quite quickly. Okay, and that is centered upon what we call the cutoff frequency of the filter, which here again is 204.5 Hertz. Now, there is also what is called the slope, or the speed or rate of the high-pass filter, which here is 12 decibels, 12 dB. Now, we can set that. I'm going to try to be typing and holding the camera at the same time, so bear with me, to 6 dB, for example. And you see that now this high-pass filter has a much more gradual slope, meaning that it has a more natural sound, but the trade-off is going to be that it's going to be letting more of the bass information through. So a 6 dB high-pass filter I have found to be good, for example, when you have music that is very natural sounding. When you have a pretty sparse track with one acoustic guitar, one lead vocal, and maybe a couple background vocals, you'll probably want the lead vocal and the acoustic guitar to be high-pass filtered in a more natural, smoother way, such as with a 6 dB high-pass filter. You can still set your frequency to somewhere between 70 and 90 or 100. But in this case, like I said, more of the low frequency information will come through, and the sound of the instrument will be more natural than it would be if the cutoff, the slope of the filter was 12 dB, which is a little bit more brutal, in quotes. But in the context of a very dense mix, that's what you're going to need in order to get a certain amount of clarity. And people are also used to hearing that. So it's not going to sound unnatural in a way that they're not used to hearing. And if you really want to get rougher with your low frequency information? Well, here in this plugin, you can go to an 18 decibel slope, which again is the slope that we have here of the high pass filter in the software. You can see how that line has gotten steeper. And in the 6 decibel case, it was a very gradual slope. It's like a hill versus a mountain, or a hill versus a cliff. 18 decibels is almost like a cliff. It's going to be almost on or off, meaning that if frequencies come in that are below our center frequency, which here is 109.3 hertz, almost all of the information below 109 hertz is going to be completely cut out, and almost all of the information above 109 hertz is going to be completely kept. So, I think I'll stop there. Sometimes I get long-winded, but for those of you that are not so familiar with the technical aspects of what a high-pass filter is and does, I think that this was probably a useful video. If you have already been exposed to high-pass filters and you already know what it means from a technical point of view, you're probably not listening to me anymore. But I'll just try to summarize here. So basically, high-pass filters are quite important, especially when you're making music that contains lots of tracks, because low frequency information builds up exponentially, or builds up very fast, as you add more and more tracks to your music production. And if you decide to high-pass filter a track, which once again I basically do to all vocals and guitars in tracks that include bass drums and bass guitars, for example, then there is a priority that I tried to express, basically a priority ranking of how you're going to get rid of that low frequency information that you don't need, and that is, well, the best is to get rid of it at the source. If the person is okay with not tapping their foot while they're standing at the microphone, then great. The second best is to get rid of the low frequency information with a high pass filter on the microphone. The third best is to do it at the preamp level. And the last resort, if you don't have any high pass filters and you couldn't get the person to stop tapping their foot, well, then you're going to use your DAW when you do your mix, which, as I mentioned toward the middle or the end of the video, I do in any case, because even if you have a high pass filter on your microphone, you would be surprised at how much low frequency rumble still gets through. Especially if you have somebody jumping up and down next to the microphone, for example, you're still going to get a hell of a lot of low frequency information that you don't want in your track. So there you have it. I hope it was informative and helpful for those of you that are not so familiar with the ins and outs of high-pass filters in audio production. Bye-bye. Thanks.